Welcome to Ask an Austrian, episode 10. My name is Guido Hülsmann. I'm a professor of economics. I'm teaching at the University of Angers, that's in Western France. Formerly, I've also been a resident fellow of the Ludwig von Mises Institute. I'm still a fellow of the Institute. So I've been a long time associated with Austrian economics. Thanks for having me to the show. Mr. Cullum sent me a list of questions, and I think I will just go down the list, start at the top and see how far we can get. So the first question is, what is my take on the FTX fiasco? Well, actually, I've not looked into this in much detail. I must say I'm not surprised that there are problems of this sort. And as far as I understand the issue, and again, I've not really looked into this very closely. As far as I can see, this is a typical problem of fractional reserve banking. In this case, applied to a Bitcoin exchange. Right? The technique of fractional reserve banking, that is issuing claims on a fractional reserve basis, is not limited to money as it has been originally, right? So it can also be applied to financial titles, and that's the case today, right? All financial exchanges, stock exchanges, bond exchanges, and so on, they are very largely based on a fractional reserve basis, right? So the trading of the financial titles themselves. And for those of you who want to know more about this, you should look up the word rehypothecation. You will find lots of articles dealing with these topics. Not much is critical. Lots of it is very technical, but there's some good comments on this. And you will see that rehypothecation of financial titles, that's repledging financial titles as security for credits and so on, is in fact a repeat operation of fractional reserve banking. So with FTX, we have the same thing, right? So it's not very surprising, and it shows that, well, I mean, whatever you might think about Bitcoin and similar cryptocurrencies, right? I mean, even if Bitcoin per se was a wonderful money, so a base money, what economists would call a base money, or money in the narrow sense, you could not avoid that there be problems of the sort, to the extent that people are building fractional reserve operations on that basis. There's another question of the same sort, which is, would fractional reserve banking exist in the free market? I think yes. I think as long as the only thing that really prevents fractional reserve banking is that people refuse to deal with fractional reserve banks. So as long as people want to try it out, it will happen to some extent. And that's not a problem, because as long as fractional reserve banks are not bailed out by taxpayer money or other forms of coercion, that's really is really not much of an issue, right? As long as they are very upfront about this. The problem would emerge if there's a fraudulent presentation of things, right? That a bank would present its own operation as being non-fractional reserve, so it's being full reserve, some money warehouse operation, whereas in fact they're operating on a fractional reserve basis. That would be fraudulent. It would also be liable to civil pursuits in a libertarian society, even if there's no government around. Are there any proto-Austrians I recommend reading? Authors who have published before Karl Menger, the times of Karl Menger. Well, I definitely would recommend a lot Frédéric Bastiat. Bastiat is a French economist of the 19th century. He was born in 1801 and died in 1850. He was a brilliant writer and very much in tune with the Austrians. And what Bastiat was lacking was the price theory that was developed by Karl Menger and then Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk, and also to some extent, of course, the monetary theory that came out of the pen of Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard and others. But other than this, Bastia is really a wonderful author. In particular, what I love about Bastia is his very realistic take on the state. And so he once presented the state as the great fiction through which everybody tries to live at the expense of everybody else. That's a famous aphorism. And he had lots of other interesting things to say, in which he presented in a very vivid style. Apart from Bastia, I would also recommend Jean-Baptiste Say. It's easy to find his textbook, Treatise on Political Economy, online, right? So there's this site archive.org, and you'll find free online versions of this book for download. I also like Adam Smith. Despite all critical things that have been said about Smith from an Austrian point of view, I like David Hume, especially his essays, which were written in the 1750s. Yeah, so there are definitely proto-Austrians that I recommend reading. There was a similar question here somewhere. Wait a minute. I think the question was, what is my favorite non-Austrian or non-libertarian book? I don't see the question here. Well, in any case, my favorite non-libertarian book is it's always the next book that I read. I don't really have much of a favorite. I'm a big fan of Mises, of course, but I'm also a big fan of Bastia. But of course, you have to read your classics and the authors that you admire. You have to reread them again from time to time. But then, if you are curious, you just will enjoy about reading any book that you hope will teach you something. So right now, for example, I'm reading a German legal scholar by the name of Carl Schmitt. I've been reading him 20 years ago, also for some other context, and through various accidents, I came back to him. And Schmitt is actually was a bit of a deception. I'd forgotten how much of a historicist he was. So he's very much his scholarship is based on analyzing in detail questions of legal development, legal doctrine, and so on. That's not necessarily interesting for somebody who is not a lawyer. But Schmitt was famous for concepts like the distinction between friend and foe, right? Friend and enemy. And all the interesting things that he's come up with are, in a way, are universals. Right? So they're all true at all times in all places. The trouble with Schmitt is that he himself didn't believe really that there were any universals. It's kind of contradictory. But yeah, so it's interesting. I think it's always worthwhile to read people with whom you do not necessarily agree if they're very intelligent. So you can learn a lot from them. You can also learn a lot from their errors. There's a question from Lime. What contributions, if any, do ancient philosophers provide for Austrian economics or libertarianism? Well, that's kind of difficult to say, right? Because Austrian economics is a very specific doctrine, libertarianism as well. I would say, in general, it's always good to read widely, and this is something that Mises also said at various occasions. It's helpful to read widely, even people who, especially people whom you might not agree with, because it allows you to gain a wider perspective on the arguments that you hold to be true and crucial. And sometimes it's you don't know where this will be leading, right? Sometimes you read a book, whatever, on theology, ontology, or something like this, and you don't quite see the connection with Austrian economics and libertarianism. But if you let things sink in, at some point in the future, it might come back to you and say, yeah, there is a connection. And it actually might be something that is helping you to reinforce an argument that you had been considering so far in a different context. Right? So there's no specific ancient philosopher that I would recommend for Austrian economics, except of course my big favorites. The usual suspects are Aristotle, right, and Thomas Aquinas, who I love a lot. And then there's a German philosopher of the 20th century, Joseph Pieper, is one of my favorites, and Etienne Gilson is a French philosopher, also of the 20th century, who have written great books on topics that are directly or indirectly relevant for Austrian economics. For example, next year I'll publish with the Mises Institute a book on gratuitous goods. So all kinds of stuff that you do not pay for, things that come for free, right? Free lunches, in a way. So which includes gifts on the one hand, and then also lots of side effect goods, right? Positive externalities that result from market exchange and other from other human choices. And in preparing this book, I've relied a lot, and I learned a lot actually by reading Pieper's book. What's the English title? The German title is Muße und Kult. So it's leisure and culture, something like this. You'll find it also online, I think. There should be a copy available. I got a copy online. So this was very helpful because he stressed the importance of leisure. Leisure is human activity that is not geared toward distinct purpose, to obtaining a certain result, to earning revenue, for example. So it's just dedicating yourself to something else or to some other person. And the consequence of leisure are all kinds of good things that follow from both for yourself and for other people. So lots of unintentional, gratuitous goods for others. Next question would be, when we talk about the effects of the dollar losing its purchasing power over time, especially since the creation of the Federal Reserve, how do we factor in the amazing innovations the market has provided since then, which mostly make our lives better? Money couldn't buy things like televisions, computers, Stratocaster guitars, I don't know what that is, mobile phones and advanced healthcare back then. And most other products and services available back then are available with much better quality today. So what does it really mean to say the 1913 dollar is worth less than the 2022 dollar? That's a very good question, right? So it's indeed, it's a big problem, right? If the goods that you can exchange for money today are completely different than the goods that you could exchange for money in 1930. Yeah, it is a big problem, and I don't really have an answer for this. It's easier to make such comparisons within a shorter time period where the kind of goods that you would exchange on the market for money do not change that much, right? So that's what statisticians had done in previous years, so let's say roughly between the 1920s and 1980 or so. And then more recently, in the 1990s, they've started changing the standard of comparison, right? So the basket of goods in terms of which you would try to measure the purchasing power of money, they changed this every single year. So that's called the technique of the rolling base year. Now that's, of course, that's absurd, right? Because if you change it every single year, you're no longer comparing money to the same thing, right? So the whole exercise is no longer really measuring something, right? It's like measuring your children with an inch rod, right? And the inch rod changes every year, right? So it has no meaning. So yeah, it's very difficult to make such measurements, right? What you can do meaningfully is to make comparisons of the purchasing power of money within a 10 or 15 year framework. And then you can see, well, in every 10 or 15 years, you change the basket against which you compare the purchasing power of money. And then what you could see typically throughout the 20th century is that as compared to the successive baskets, money would always lose its purchasing power, right? So the dollar would lose in the 1960s, it would lose in the 1970s, and the 1980s. Well, it has been losing purchasing power almost all the time, right? Except for a few years in the interwar period. So therefore, you can conclude that since it has lost purchasing power all the time, well, the purchasing power today is definitely lower than it would have been in 1913, but how much, it's impossible to specify. Right? So that's the problem. So if you want to learn more about this, about these things, a young economist by the name of Carl Friedrich Israel has published recently a few papers dealing with this question, and also the issue of measuring inflation and so on. So you can look him up on the internet. Israel, right? No, not Israel Kürzner, but Israel is his family name. So the first name is Carl Friedrich. It's very German. Okay, next question. Can you talk about the so-called milkshake theory? Well, I've never heard about that, which I think tries to explain why the dollar is remaining strong against other world fiat currencies, despite what the Fed is doing. Does this also explain why Bitcoin, other crypto, and gold don't seem to be doing as well as one might think in a highly inflationary period? Well, again, so I'm sorry, I don't know what the milkshake theory is, but well, the dollar has remained strong simply because the dollar is, on the world standard, it's the most widely used medium of exchange. And so the dollar on the world scale is probably the only international money right now, apart from the natural monies, gold and silver, right, which are also used everywhere. But dollars can be used, very liquid. There can be exchanged all kinds of goods. They can be exchanged on financial exchanges, stock exchanges, and so on. Right? You cannot sell a bunch of shares of a company in exchange for gold, right, or for silver. You would first have to buy dollars, and then you could buy gold and silver. So the dollars are definitely well, the most widely used medium of exchange, and that's beneficial for the dollar, especially each time there is a financial crisis or there's a military crisis or some other some form of shakeup on the international level. Right? So that's why the dollar has been faring well recently, even though the Fed has been pursuing a very expansionary policy. Right? And there's been great concerns that the price inflation rate might be still higher than it is today, and it's pretty high as compared to what we had during the past 40 years. But again, that's only one reason why you would like to own dollars, right? To protect your, to keep a money that you would that keeps its purchasing price. Of course, one motivation. But it's there are other motivations, right? Even if the dollar loses its purchasing power 10%, 15% on an annual basis, and probably even if it's a bit higher, it might still be useful to own dollars because it gives you access to all kinds of other goods. Of course, the higher is the price inflation rate, right? The more you lose while owning dollars, the worse it is, right? The greater are your incentives to look for something else. The trouble is there is nothing else that's comparable right now. On an international scale. I forget about the euro, forget about the British pound, forget about the yen and yuan, same thing, right? So there is nothing that comes close to the dollar. Next question. In an anarcho-capitalist world, what would happen with nuclear weapons? Who would ensure that uranium doesn't fall in wrong hands? If anarcho-capitalism is to take over state, okay, how would the transformation take place? Well, actually, yeah, that's a good question. And the short answer is that there is nothing that really ensures, in the sense of guarantees, that the uranium would not fall in wrong hands. And all I can say is that that's not a deterioration as compared to the current situation. because right now we have the same thing, right? Who prevents that uranium falls into the wrong hands? and the answer is nothing. And probably there's a lot of uranium already now in the wrong hands, right? So you have a technology like this, nuclear bombs and so on. Yeah, I mean, there is always the risk, there's always a possibility that some crazy people will use nuclear bombs. And these people might very well in government. All we can say from a libertarian point of view is that the incentives to use nuclear bombs are greater when you have when you're a government, right? Because you can always, especially if you're stronger than your foreign enemies and so on, right? You can always claim well, innocence, or can justify yourself before, in front of public opinion, because you control the media, because you own international courts that, or you can avoid being dragged toward in front of an international court, right? There's this international criminal court in The Hague in the Netherlands, at which lots of heads of state have been judged in the past, but these were always heads of state of small governments, right, of small states that could not stand up to the big powers, like the US in particular, but also Russia or China, France, Britain, right? None of these countries that are in the Security Council of the United Nations have ever been accused or have ever been judged in The Hague, right? So, and that would be different if you had a state-free situation, because then the probability that criminals could just escape like this from responsibility is less. It's not impossible, but it's less. Anyways, that's what I think about this. The next question is libertarianism necessarily for open borders or freedom of movement? And the answer is no, because libertarianism is all about private property rights, right? So the movement that takes place must always take place with the consent of the people who own the streets, right? And if you want to go somewhere, well, there's always ground, right? So the ground is always owned by somebody. So you cannot go in a libertarian society, you cannot go anywhere without the permission of those people, right? And of course, there might be people who would be in the business of getting people from place A to place B, transport business, and road owners might also happy to carry people on and so on. But typically, they would not like them to stay eternally on their ground, right? They bring them from A to B, but then they want to get rid of them also, right? So unless those who want to move from one place to another will be welcome at the final destination, they could not go, right? Now, in any society, whether it's libertarian or not, there are always people who are happy to welcome foreigners and so on, and others who do not, right? So there would be some balance somewhere. But it's wrong to think that libertarianism is necessarily for open borders, right? Libertarianism is for voluntary interaction. So as long as all people agree, those who move and those who receive them, that's fine. And if those who receive the people who are moving do not agree, that is, if they do not want to receive them, that's not good from a libertarian point of view. The next question is, can you explain Austrian capital theory? Wow. Okay, well, I'll skip that because it's a bit large. Right? Well, why don't you look at a good textbook? I would look at Murray Rothbard's Man, Economy and State, read chapters 5 and following, right? 5, 6, 7, 3 chapters. That's probably the best presentation. Also, Mark Skousen has written a nice book, a textbook. Roger Garrison is less of a textbook, but it's usable. Time and money, right? So these are texts. I cannot present this in a few minutes. Next question would be, how did I feel studying mainstream economics while knowing about the Austrian school? Actually, I I did not study mainstream economics while knowing about the Austrian school. I first studied mainstream economics, and the reason why I got into economics is actually Keynesian economics, because I like Keynesian economics. Keynesian economics is great because it puts the reader into the position of a pseudo tyrant, right? So it explains you just what a benevolent dictator would have to do in order to create growth, reduce unemployment, and so on, right? So make the world a better place. And that's what attracted me at the time. So I first studied Keynesian macroeconomics and all kinds of other elements of standard economics. And then later on, came to know about the Austrian school. That was actually, I came to know the Austrian school shortly before I studied my doctoral studies. So in a way, it was beneficial, right? That I did not have to torture myself learning the other stuff. But then I had still to torture myself a bit, because still later on, I had to prepare an entrance exam to become a professor at a French state university. That's how they organize it here. So I had, again, to show that I have a solid command of mainstream economics. So it was a little less fun relearning it at the time, but I did, right? So how did I feel about it? I was not particularly happy, but again, I think you can always learn from reading even things that you do not necessarily agree with right away, because most people, most authors have something to say that is valid and which can enrich your own thought, right? So it's always a good thing to have a look beyond the borders of things that you currently think are relevant. Okay, the next one? What were Mises's critiques of polylogism? Well, polylogism is the Marxian, or is Marxist doctrine that there's a strict separation between the logic of a bourgeois person and the logic of a proletarian. So whatever criticism a bourgeois economist might make of Marxist plans are ultimately irrelevant. Right? So you can come up with clever critique and so on, but it doesn't count, so to say, because that's just bourgeois logic, and it's irrelevant for the world of proletarians who are instructed by Marxist thought. Right? So that's the argument. And of course, that kind of argument is very had a long history. It's been developing since the 19th century into our present day, and it always pops up in various ways, right? So I mean, you find today feminists who are making claims of the same sort, right? They're saying, well, whatever might be said about feminism and so on, all the critical points that might be brought up are irrelevant because women think completely different than men, right? Or black people think completely different than white people, right? In the 1930s, you had guys in Germany running around and said, well, we have German logic, we have German mathematics and Aryan physics and stuff like this, right? So the argument is the same. What's the trouble with this argument? And Mises pointed out that I think that's already this consideration alone completely explodes it. It's self-contradictory, right? It's if you are responding with this argument to somebody else, well, so as you respond to a criticism, well, then you already accept that person would understand your rejoinder, right? So that you make this point that he would be able to understand this, right? And that's the precondition of any meaningful discussion at all, right? That you presuppose that the other person to whom you're addressing yourself, with whom you're just having a discussion or a disagreement, does have the same mind as you, right? So the logic is not really different. And if you do not believe that is true, then it makes no sense talking to that person at all. And so therefore the coherent Marxists and similar people today actually they do not spend much time talking to other people. They just want to manipulate them, or they want to subdue them, right? They want to prevent that they have any influence on public matters, public affairs. So there's, in their eyes, there's no a point in coming to an agreement, discussing anything at all, because there's no possibility for an understanding. That's at least coherent, right? But it's still contradictory, right? Because if you make this kind of claim, right, then why should there be a different logic only between white and black, Aryans, non-Aryans, bourgeois, proletarians, and so on? Why not also different logics between different subgroups of proletarians and so on? How do you know, in fact, what is the logical structure of the mindset of this and that person? The next question is, what is methodological individualism? Well, it is the methodological individualism argues that the only way to understand social phenomena, so that result from the interaction of lots of different people, is to start understanding individual actions, right? Individual human behavior. So you always have to reconstrue what happens globally by first analyzing individual actions, and then see how individual actions, whether they are coordinated or not, produce the overall result, right? Because ultimately, all things that take place in society and politics and so on, all things that somehow result from human action, always result from individual human action, right? The expression itself comes from Joseph Schumpeter, right? So he used it, I think, the first time in the early 1900s, so 1906 or something. He definitely used it in his 1908 book, of which I will not give you the title because it's in German. Okay, the next question is, what is your favorite thing that you've learned from reading and writing about Mises? Are there any favorite stories or facts about Mises himself that you've also learned? Favorite thing, that's always difficult. I've always difficult to say what is my favorite thing, because I love a lot of things. Well, definitely, I like Mises books, right? I mean, that's also, I'm an economist, right? What I learned about his life and his professional activities and so on, I found this very interesting, but it's certainly not what I loved most about him, right? Well, it's not what is my favorite thing about him. My favorite thing about him is really his books. He's a genius. He's one of the greatest intellectuals in the history of the West, and probably the greatest economist ever. Right. So that's my impression, and the way to appreciate this by reading his books, in particular four great books that I recommend that anybody who's interested in Mises should acquaint himself with. This is The Theory of Money and Credit, Socialism, Human Action, and Theory and History. And actually, I think there's also a fifth book that I would recommend very much, especially if you have a little philosophical bent. You should read its very last book with the title Ultimate Foundation of Economic Science, published in 1962. It's a fairly short book, probably one of his shortest books, and it's just wonderful. What is the time preference theory of interest? In fact, there are two versions of the time preference theory of interest, at least two versions, right? So one comes from Böhm-Bawerk, and Böhm-Bawerk says, well, it's the theory according to which people, all people, right, all human beings tend to prefer ceteris paribus present goods to future goods of the same kind, right? So if I can have an apple now or an apple in the future next week or so, then I would prefer to have the apple now rather than next week, right? So, but Böhm-Bawerk admitted that, and Böhm-Bawerk thought that, in fact, as a rule, right, people have the preference for present goods over future goods. And he gave three famous reasons for this. I won't go into this now, but you'll find it easily on the internet. But he also admitted that time preference was not always positive. That is, it's not necessarily the case that you prefer present goods to future goods, right? There can be circumstances under which you would prefer future goods to present goods. And other economists who have developed that theory along Babekian lines thought the same thing. One example would be Irving Fisher, right? Famous American economist of the first half of the 20th century. Now, in Mises, we find a different variant of the same theory. Mises says that time preference is manifest in the fact that whatever we do, we prefer to have the result sooner rather than later. Right? So the very fact that I'm talking now demonstrates that I want to get this done sooner rather than later. And if I go to bed, I want to get rest sooner rather than later, right? So in that sense, of course, time preference is universal, right? It's not possible that there be any exception. The other question is whether time preference understood in that sense would explain interest rates on the market. And so, and here I don't think that is the case, and I've presented the reasons for my criticism of the time preference theory in a 2002 article that you can find on the internet. The article has the title "A Theory of Interest." The next question: why aren't economic laws empirical regularities? Well, actually, they might be, right? The trouble is that we cannot observe those empirical realities. And the reason is that whatever we observe in society and on the market and so on is the consequence of a lot of different causes that come into play simultaneously, right? So it's always a complex phenomenon, right? That was Karl Menger's expression, right? All things on the market, even an individual price, is a complex phenomenon because it is the combined result of lots of different factors that come into play in forming the price. Now, in the natural sciences, we have the same situation, right? Whatever we observe in nature is typically the combined result of lots of different factors, right? And if we didn't have the possibility to conduct laboratory experiments, it would actually be quite difficult to come to the idea of having that there might be any irregularities or universal causal relationships of any sort, right? I think Bertrand Russell he had once expressed this idea in one of his books. I don't remember the title, and he said something like, "Well, actually, the reason why man has come to think that there are regularities, that there are laws, right, laws of nature, is due to our very peculiar situation that we have, right? Because we can observe, for example, the stars behave in a regular way, and so that was one of the initial motivations of thinking, right, that there might be irregularities. If we were much smaller, right, if we were so small that we were moving on a molecular level and so on, there would be so much chaos, according to Russell, that we would never see any order at all, right, any irregularities at all. And if we were much larger than we really are, we would have the same difficulties. Well, so the reason why we can describe empirical regularities is, well, first of all, because we have astronomy, so there things have been discovered. These regularities have been discovered the first time, and then especially because we have laboratory experiments. Right? In a laboratory experiment, what we do is to create conditions such as that we exclude the influence of all other factors except for the one that we want to study. And then we see if our experiment is well construed, then we see the impact, so the operation of this one factor, we see the empirical regularity. Now that's not possible in economics, right? But I think that if we could construe laboratory experiments, and the economists are trying to do this right now, it's called experimental economics, but I think it's nonsense. And I won't go into this now. It doesn't work in the case of human action. But if we could, okay, then we would also observe these regularities empirically. As things are standing, so we cannot conduct laboratory experiments in as far as human action is concerned, and the social sciences more generally. Well, we have to conduct mental experiments, right? That's an expression of the Austrian philosopher Ernst Mach. He was a philosopher of physics, and he didn't have much money in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. So the Austrian physicists were poor, which distinguished them from the German ones. So the Germans had all the money and they could set up big laboratories and so on, conduct these experiments. And the Austrians didn't have any money, so they had to just think things through. Okay, so we need to conduct mental experiments, Gedankenexperimente, and actually the Austrians were doing very well, right? So they on the theoretical level, they were not behind the Germans at all. And in economics, probably Gedankenexperimente are the only things that we can do. And unfortunately, many economists refuse to do this, as they just look desperately to find numbers to crunch and some pseudo experiments to conduct and so on, in the hope that they would find any irregularities coming close to some universal causal relationship. But you never get there this way, right? So really, mental experiments are the only way to go about this. What's the worst consequence of money production? I have difficulties responding to this question because money production is actually fine. Why should there be any bad consequence resulting from this? I guess the question refers to monetary interventionism, right? Because on a free market, it's normal that, of course, people, you have something like money as a good, and people, by producing a good, people obtain the source of revenues, right? So it's normal that they will try to produce that good. And in a free market, there would be a production of gold and a production of silver, right? There would be mining, and people would produce coins and so on. And that's not bad. That's good for those who are concerned. And it's also good for those who use gold and silver for exchange, right? If they are the first ones to be able to exchange them, right? They gain, even though that gain might be at the expense of other people. But that's not fundamentally different from, let's say, if you're a specialist in the production of clothes, right? You produce clothes, and that's for you a source of revenue. And if you produce a lot of those, well, you gain relatively to other market participants, right? That's what's driving you. That's not bad per se. What monetary interventionism is bad because it's unjust, right? So it's based on the violation of property rights, and it leads to various nefarious consequences. And probably the most nefarious consequence is the deresponsibilization of the market participants, right? Especially if we think of something like the production of fiat money, right? You have a central bank that's producing immaterial money tokens, right? Banknotes and accounting money and so on, and is able to impose this on the market. Then, of course, the first users of these money units, well, they also benefit at the expense of others, but they benefit without genuine contribution, right? They've not provided a service to these others. They are just benefiting from the fact that they are able to screw the others by coercing them to use a type of money that nobody really wants to use, right? And so, as a consequence, we have all this laxism in the conduct of business, right? If you look at commercial banks, how they run their business, it's in fact it's very frivolous, right? Because they're no longer responsible. They can rely on the assistance coming from the central banks and also from the government. As a consequence, they're just chasing profits without taking any precautions on their own side to stay in business, because the central bank and the government are just taking all obstacles out of their way and helping them whenever they are in dire straits. Now that's problematic, right? Because not only because it creates a shabby character, but also because it wastes a lot of resources in the market. Now I see we have 45 minutes, and in fact I need to close very soon. So I'll answer the last question. Okay, let me just see. How do you respond to critics of anarcho-capitalism that argue corporations would fill the power vacuum left by the state? Well, I would say that yes, it's possible that corporations could fill that power vacuum. It's true, but I mean, again, what the state has a monopoly, right? It's not subject to competition, right? Even if you have a corporation, so it's very powerful, very big, and today some corporations are very powerful and very big, precisely because we have the state, right? We have an organization that keeps competition out of the way and creates excessively large business and excessively powerful businesses. So if you have a corporation that steps into play, but without the presence of a state, that corporation could certainly abuse its current power, right? But it couldn't build anymore, right? So if it abused its current power, it would consume its capital. Because people would have the possibility to avoid dealing with the corporation. And the second answer that I would give is, well, I mean, again, what's the difference as compared to the current situation? Don't we have already now corporations running our lives? We just think of media corporations, and we think of money and the internet and various other services, right? We have lots of big corporations that are as big as they are, among other things, not only, but among other things, because they have the support of government. So they are, to some extent, making our lives more miserable because they have the government support. So what could get worse than the current situation? And the very last one, okay, what is the proper role of math and economics? Well, economics, we need math at best of the very elementary sort, right? Plus, minus, times, divided by. It's not more complicated than that. And the reason is that the quantities that we are dealing with, quantities of economic goods, they're not actually homogeneous. Right? Mathematics is built on the premise that all the quantities you're dealing with, abstract quantities, they're homogeneous, right? There's 1, 1, 1, 1, so it can add up and makes 3. But in economics, we have the what is called the law of diminishing marginal utility, right? Which tells us that quantity of 3 apples has a greater value than the quantity of 2 apples, but it's not 3 seconds more, right? It's not 1.5 times more than 2 apples. And the reason is that each additional apple makes that each unit in that larger stock has a lower value than each unit of the previously smaller stock, right? So the apples in the larger stock do not have the same economic significance than the apples in a smaller stock. Right? We cannot just add them up. Right? We cannot add up their economic significance, and that makes that the application of mathematics as far as prices and value and so on is concerned is impossible in economics. So we better try to forget about this. I know that that's not what most mainstream economists do, but it's an error and it's a waste of time. But since they like to play with numbers, I mean, there's no way of preventing them from doing this, and I let them do this, and that's fine. And it keeps the way free for Austrians. We have a lot more to do because all the other guys are wasting their time with questions that don't have answers. Well, I hope it was somewhat useful. What I said, I'm not sure, but you'll tell me. And I wish you a pleasant evening, and maybe we'll see each other again on another occasion. Bye bye.